Hi, everybody. It's a little bit hard to believe, but we're already on to our third unit in AP Comparative. We are going to cover the second of our 6 course countries in this unit. So our next country is Mexico. So when College Board was creating this course, why did they pick Mexico as one of the 6 countries for us to study? Well, first of all, Mexico has a presidential system that is heavily modeled after the American system. So straight away, we're going to be able to compare the parliamentary system of the UK to the presidential system of Mexico. One of the things that is unique about how Mexico does things, they have a single term for their president of 6 years. It's known as the sexenio. Okay, and we'll get into like why they decided to put that rule into effect. Mexico is a federal system, so there's another point of comparison. The UK is unitary, Mexico is federal. They have a long history of a single party rule. From about the 1930s until 2000, a party called the PRI was in power. They currently have a multi-party system. There are 3 competitive parties, kind of the most likely that one of the presidents would come from one of those 3 parties. But they also have a number of other smaller parties. And so often what happens is that the larger parties join hands with some of the smaller parties to create a bit of a governing coalition. Mexico has a colonial history. They were once a colony of Spain, and so we'll look at how that affects them. The drug trade has a huge impact on Mexico as well. So we're going to look at all of the different ways that it impacts their government, particularly when we look at an issue of corruption, which is a big deal in Mexico. It is a fairly culturally homogeneous country. They are very ethnically homogeneous, so most people are sort of kind of mixed European and indigenous ancestry. They are also religiously homogeneous. Mexico is a predominantly Catholic country. Mexico also has a super city, okay? These are really large cities, including their suburban areas. So Mexico's population with its suburbs is about 16 million people, so it's massive. We'll get into presidential elections a little bit more as we go through this unit, sorry. But the 2006 presidential election was pretty controversial, so we'll look at that. And then the most current presidential election was 2018. The current president is Andres Manuel López Obrador. It is a resource-rich country, particularly when we look at things like oil and gas. And so, as you guys are going to see for both Mexico and Nigeria, resources are a blessing and a curse at the same time. So we're going to talk about how Mexico manages its natural resources. We're going to talk about the history of Mexico and Nafta. Nafta is the North American Free Trade Agreement. It was a trade agreement between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico that was recently replaced by the USMCA, U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement. Ultimately, NAFTA brought economic development to the northern part of Mexico because of that, kind of near that shared border with the U.S. So Mexico is a pretty interesting country, and I think you're going to enjoy studying it. Remember as we go through this that we want to be constantly making comparisons, both similarities and differences. So right now we've just got 2 countries to compare, but as we continue further, we'll have more countries. Mexico has a democratic form of government, but is definitely a country that has transitioned to democracy over about the last 20 years. So that 20-year transition has seen some good things. Competitive political parties after a basically 70-year rule of one party known as the PRI. They have free and fair elections. They have competitive elections, okay? They have a free press. They have an open civil society. So, you're free to participate in whatever organizations or clubs or, unions, whatever you want to be a member of, you're free to do that. They also have a pretty diverse economy. You're going to see that the north of Mexico has a lot of industrial development. The south of Mexico is more agricultural. But we also have the oil and gas and the natural resources that they have as well. If we kind of look on the negative side of things, Mexico has high levels of corruption. Okay, so unfortunately, when we look at something like the drug trade, oftentimes what we will find is that there are people in the police and in the government that are a part of this system. Okay, so lots of problems from the drug trade. There are also challenges with policing and law enforcement. Again, if the police are working with the cartel or receiving payoffs from the cartel, it makes it really difficult to control the corruption and the violence that comes as a result of these drug cartels. And so we are seeing an increased level of violence due to the cartels. So we're going to spend a lot of what remains in this presentation just kind of setting the stage so you can kind of understand where Mexico has been so we can understand kind of how they ended up where they are now. Mexico is a former colony of Spain, gained its independence in the 19th century, and that was then followed by a series of military governments that lasted into the early 20th century. Once that period of military rule settled down, we entered a period of single party rule by a party called the PRI from the 1930s until 2000. So Mexico is a country that has absolutely democratized when we look at sort of their history of colonial rule, military rule, and then single party rule. So we don't really need to get too deep into Mexico's colonial period. What we do need to understand is that this period of colonial and military rule really set the stage for the corruption that we see today. What both of these different types of rule did was use force and the threat of force to help govern and control the population. Corruption really becomes a part of daily life. Okay, so governments paying off their rivals or paying off their enemies for political gain. Okay, you see on the right side of this slide, long-standing dictator Porfirio Diaz. He was the guy in the tall hat on the last slide. He basically kept control by forcing his rivals to fight with one another rather than linking up to overthrow him. So people who supported him received bribes, okay, received bread. So bribes or public office positions, grants of land, pensions, promotions, whatever it took to get them on his side. His opponents received the stick, okay, so assassinated, or if you were very lucky, just kicked out of the country. So ultimately, this really sets the stage for the culture that is still around in some places today, which is you're not going to get if you're not going to get very far as someone's opponent, you might as well at least put a little money in your pocket for your trouble of going along with whatever you're being asked to go along with. So you can still see this legacy in Mexico today. All right, so here's Diaz again in his very fancy hat. It's a pretty solid mustache. Um, he very famously said, if you give a dog a bone, he will neither bark nor bite. Okay? So what he discovers is that bribery is a very effective way to silence your political opposition. It is a very effective way to get people to leave you alone. And this is one of the things that's going to help him be in control of Mexico for so long, from 1876 to 1911. Beginning in 1910, a revolution begins, right? And the U.S. is a little bit involved in this during the administrations of William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson. Okay, but ultimately they end up deciding that they've got bigger problems in Europe, and it's not their involvement's not super effective. Okay, once Diaz is finally deposed for good in 1917. From there until the 1930s, there are multiple kind of short reigns of power for different leaders within Mexico. Okay, so there's a lot of factors that are at play here. Farmers wanted land reform. Most farmers did not own their own land. Okay, so they were essentially working as most likely tenant farmers. Okay, meaning that they were having to pay rent for the land. Okay, if you had a bad growing season, that didn't forgive your debt. It just made your debt larger because you didn't have the ability to pay it. So farmers, I think this is true for a lot of people in the world. If you own your own land, you have a little bit more control over your destiny. Okay. Um, there was definitely a huge wave of Mexican nationalism and unpopularity of outside or foreign influences. Okay, so it can be from those former colonial powers, but it can also be from a nation like the United States trying to influence the government in Mexico. Middle class Mexicans were really looking for more of a democratic government. There is a desire to reduce the influence of the Roman Catholic Church in politics. So pay attention to that. They definitely have rules about being able to serve in the government while also an official in the Catholic Church. So ultimately, this revolution is going to lead to the creation of the modern Mexican state. Are we still a fairly long way off from a modern democratic Mexican state? Yes. But this revolution is really going to create a Mexico that we recognize today. So at the end of this revolutionary period, Mexico writes its 1917 constitution. Okay, so this is really the official, if we want to think of it, written down in a constitution beginning of the modern Mexican state. And it sets up a lot of what you would recognize today, or what you're going to come to recognize. It sets up a presidential federal system of government. This is absolutely modeled after the United States. So you're going to see a lot of similarities in the way that their government functions, a presidential federal system, to the US. It's not identical, but it's very similar. One of the things they are going to set up is state control over natural resources, particularly the vast oil and gas resources. All right. It's 1917. We're really just beginning to discover oil and figure out uses for it. So they're definitely really ahead when you think about something like that. They create not only a separation of church and state, but they make it official that the church is subordinate to the state. Okay, so the state has supreme authority over the church. They also create the ability for government to redistribute land. And this is obviously something that's going to be controversial, but to be able to take the land from some wealthier people and be able to redistribute it to the farmers that are actually working the land. So remember, that's what those farmers wanted. They wanted some ability to be able to work their own land. Unfortunately, just because some of these things were written down on paper does not mean that they were put into practice in real life. So that's why this is kind of referred to as a frozen revolution. Sorry. So many of these important reforms were not actually realized. For example, the massive land reform. I think you can look at lots of examples around the world of discussions of redistribution of land, but oftentimes this does not actually happen for a variety of different reasons. Okay, obviously it is unpopular for the people that own the land to have their land taken from them and given to someone else. Okay, we also have to understand oftentimes who is in the government, and it is the landowners and not the land renters. Okay, so that's an issue as well. So without substantive reform, such as land reform, it creates a gap between fairly wealthy people and people who live in poverty. And that wealth gap is still present in Mexico today. The power also remains in the hands of a very few number of people. And again, those tend to be the people with land, with money, not the people that are trying to gain more power and influence in the government. Okay, so we're going to start to look at the political structure and then the various government institutions in Mexico. Okay, for now, we're going to talk about federalism and the basic structure of government. And then next time, we will get into the formal setup of the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government in Mexico. So again, Mexico is a federal state, okay? So just as a reminder, that means that power is shared between local governments, state governments in this case, and the national government. Regionalism is very strong in Mexico. In fact, you're going to learn later about a regional cleavage in Mexico between northern people that live in the northern part of the country and in the southern part of the country. So I want you to think back a little bit about why countries choose federalism. And one of the reasons for that is that for a country like Mexico that is so large, it often works well for people at the local level to be able to make some decisions, right? As I said, you're also going to notice an economic cleavage in Mexico between the northern part of the country that tends to be more industrial and more economically prosperous, and the southern part of Mexico that tends to be a little poorer and a little more agricultural, right? There are certain places in Mexico as well, as you're going to see, where indigenous communities want the right of self-determination and the ability to make some decisions. They also have one federal city. Okay, so if you think about like Washington, D.C. is a federal city, Mexico City is the same concept. A difference, though, is that Mexico City is treated like a state, okay, versus Washington, D.C. is not treated as a state, right? So they get members of the legislature and the ability to vote for president and all of those other things that come along with being a state. All right, so let's hit the basics. All right, the 1917 Constitution provides legitimacy to the president. Okay, it sets a structure for the presidential system, and it sets up kind of a formation for the government. Okay, their presidential system is strongly based on the United States, so you're going to see a lot of similarities there when we get to executive. They have 3 branches of government with a system of checks and balances. They can have divided government. So this is another great place to compare the UK and Mexico, all right? Remember, because of the parliamentary system in the UK, it is impossible to have a divided government, okay? What do we mean by divided government? We're talking about the leader of the country and the party that controls the legislature being different, okay? That can never happen in the UK because the party in power in the parliament picks the prime minister, okay? So you're never going to have divided government. That is not the case in a presidential system. It is possible to have a president from one party and a different party in control of the legislature. Okay, so there's good and bad points there. You've got different perspectives represented, but it can also slow down the lawmaking process. Okay, it's a federal republic, so we've kind of talked about that concept of federalism. Republic just means that you are the people elect representatives to represent them in the national legislature. They also have a code law system. Okay, so got to remember the differences there. We need to be able to compare. A common law system is based on tradition. Okay, a code law system is more formal and has all of the laws specifically written down. Okay, so we're going to wrap this up for today. I hope you've made note of any questions that you might have. Definitely please make sure you get those questions answered. You can text them to me or you can ask me the next time we're together in class.